What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. And today, we have another installment of our favorite stories from history. Today's story is called Isaac's Storm, a man at time and the deadliest hurricane in history. Fascinating to its core, and all the more compelling for being true. Soon, though, the winds began to rise, peaking at an estimated 145 miles per hour. Within minutes, rain lashed down in torrents. The seawall was breached. People desperately ran for higher ground, while others sought refuge in the small business buildings. As the storm surged through the island, Cline made his way to the second floor of a brick building. There he witnessed the most terrifying moment of his life, as waves crashed over the top of the seawall and rushed inland. Houses were swept away like toys, and people were forced to abandon their vehicles and flee. Dazed but alive, he emerged from the rubble only to find himself knee-deep in water. He could see that the storm was not letting up, and that the destruction it was causing was unlike anything he had ever seen before. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the storm had passed, and the residents of Galveston were left to survey the damage. What they found was beyond their worst fears. He struggled to his feet and stumbled through the wreckage until he reached higher ground. Homes, businesses, piers, wharves, and other structures were destroyed or washed away. He had been limited by the technology of his day and by the lack of understanding of hurricanes. We now know that the storm surge was the deadliest in recorded history, and that the wind had reached speeds of up to 145 miles per hour, and his legacy lives on in the National Weather Service. His story is a reminder of the power of nature and the importance of being prepared. I hope you enjoyed this terrifying tale of survival against the odds. If you did, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and leave us a comment about what you thought. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. Until next time, stay safe and keep an eye on the skies. It is also a tribute to the human spirit of resilience in the face of disaster. But at the time, no one understood the true power of the storm, and rushed inland. He knew that he was in the midst of a natural disaster of epic proportions. He had done everything he could to warn the residents of Galveston, but it wasn't enough. The storm surge was too powerful, and the wind was too strong. As he watched the destruction wrought by the storm, he knew that he had just witnessed the worst hurricane in American history. The lives of thousands of people were also lost. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is believed that between 6,000 and 12,000 people perished in the storm. They knew that he had done his best and that he was not to blame for the disaster. Cline continued to work in Galveston until his retirement in 1930. He died in 1920 at the age of 62. Many bodies were never recovered, and the true number may never be known. There he watched as the storm surge continued to wreak havoc, destroying everything in its path. The small town of Galveston was left in ruins. The storm surge had been the deadliest in recorded history. They had lost everything, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. The city of Galveston was eventually rebuilt, and it is now a thriving tourist destination. But the memory of the 1900 storm still lives on, and the wind had reached speeds of up to 145 miles per hour. They also take time to remember Isaac Cline, the meteorologist, who had done his best to warn the residents of the impending disaster. He had sent out urgent messages to the nearby cities, but they had not been taken seriously. In fact, many people had scoffed at his predictions and had gone about their business as usual. It was only after the storm had struck that they realized the danger that they had been in. The water rose to a height of 15 to 20 feet in some places and swept inland for several blocks. September 8, 1900, began innocently in the seaside town of Galveston, Texas. Dazed but alive, he emerged from the rubble only to find himself knee-deep in water. He struggled to his feet and stumbled through the wreckage until he reached higher ground. When the sun finally rose the following morning, the extent of the devastation became clear. Cline surveyed the scene and realized that a large portion of Galveston Island had vanished. Homes, businesses, piers, wharves, and the lives of some 6,000 to 12,000 people were gone. He had survived the worst hurricane in American history. Even Isaac Cline, resident meteorologist for the U.S. Weather Bureau, failed to grasp the true meaning of the strange deep-sea swells and peculiar winds that greeted the city that morning. But by nightfall, he and his fellow townspeople would face the wrath of nature in the form of a monstrous hurricane. And if you like it, make sure to check out the playlist where we do these every week. But without further ado, let's jump into today's video. A gripping account of one man's struggle to comprehend the deadliest hurricane in history. As the storm approached, Cline recorded the rising water levels, noting that by 6 p.m., they were almost at the point of overflowing the protective seawall. Unable to withstand the category for hurricane, the brick building collapsed, sending Cline tumbling into a pile of debris. When the storm hit, Galveston was a thriving port city with a population of around 37,000. It was known for its beautiful beaches, mild climate, and balmy Gulf breezes. However, the city was also prone to hurricanes, and the residents had experienced their fair share of tropical storms. On September, however, the approaching storm was unlike any they had seen before. The first sign of trouble was the unusually high tides and strong currents that began to batter the island on the evening of September 7th. Residents noticed that the sea was receding farther than usual, exposing the ocean floor to view. This was an ominous sign that something big was coming. The next morning, Isaac Cline, the local meteorologist, recorded the rising water levels and noted that by 6 p.m., they were almost at the point of overflowing the protective sea. His instruments indicated that a storm was brewing off the coast of Texas, and he sent a telegraph message to this effect to the nearest Weather Bureau office in New Orleans. However, the full force of the approaching storm was not yet apparent. By late afternoon, the wind began to rise, and by 7 p.m., it was blowing at 35 to 40 miles per hour. At 8 p.m., the storm surge began. Waves crashed over the seawall and poured into the streets. People ran for higher ground or sought refuge in the small business buildings. The wind grew steadily stronger, and by 9 p.m. it was estimated to be blowing at 100 miles per hour. Cline decided to make his way to the second floor of a brick building at 24th and Mechanic Streets. There he watched in horror as waves crashed over the top of the seawall and rushed inland. He saw houses being swept away like toys and trees uprooted and hurled through the air. The sound of the wind in the water was deafening. People were forced to abandon their vehicles and flee for higher ground. Some took shelter in the few buildings that were sturdy enough to withstand the storm, while others climbed into their attics. Around 10 p.m., the brick building where Cline was taking shelter collapsed, sending him tumbling into a pile of debris. As the storm raged through the night, Cline estimated that the wind was blowing at 145 miles per hour. Cline wrote in his report that he had never imagined such a terrible calamity was possible. A large portion of Galveston Island had literally vanished. The storm had caused an estimated $20 to $40 million in damage, which was more than the combined value of the previous 4 hurricanes that had hit the United States. In the aftermath of the storm, survivors began the long task of rebuilding their lives. Every year on September, the residents of Galveston come together to remember the victims of the storm and to honor the survivors. Cline had been vilified for not being able to predict the storm with greater accuracy, but in reality, he had done all that he could. In the days following the storm, there were calls for Cline's resignation, but the citizens of Galveston stood by their meat. Today, Isaac Cline is remembered as a hero. He is the subject of a book and a documentary film. When Isaac Cline witnessed the most terrifying moment of his life as waves crashed over the top of the seawall. Folks, that's about gonna do it for today's video.